Thank you to Acelerin for sponsoring the Clinical Trials Uncovered What You Need to Know webinar series. Hi, everyone. My name is Brinley Brooks. I'm the founder and executive director of HS Connect, and we are in episode 103 of our clinical trial webinar series, Uncovering and Demystifying Clinical Trials. And today we're joined by Dr. Chris Syed. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, glad to be here, of course.
And we're going to go ahead and get started. And today we're going to talk about the importance of participation in clinical trials, why the HS community needs to be on high alert and involved and ready to participate in as many trials as humanly possible, so that we can keep this wave of new treatment going. So Dr. Syed, I'll let you introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, all that good stuff, and then we can jump into it.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the Department of Dermatology. See lots and lots of patients with HS. I've kind of been really subspecialized in HS for like 8 or 9 years now, and probably about 75% of the patients I see have HS. And so we're trying to do as much as we can, but there's too many patients to ever take care of. There are a lot of patients with HS, and I'm trying to keep up and feeling very guilty when I know it's more longer and longer times people are waiting. But hopefully by doing things like educating residents where I am and sort of getting out there and talking about it, we get more people interested that can do a good job and not rely on so few specialists. We need more people doing this. I have I'm fortunate to be in a program where we have a clinical trials unit, and so I can kind of be plugged in and offer that as an option for patients. And there are pluses and minuses to clinical trials. I'll try to kind of, again, I know the idea of this is to talk that through and think through, are they a good fit or not? The importance of them. I think I feel those are things we'll kind of hash out as we talk more, though.
Perfect. All right, so I will go ahead and we will share our screen here and get started. Dr. Syed created a couple of slides for us so that we can talk through this, and then we'll also, again, like free-flowing conversation as we're going. We don't have to stick to anything in particular, so that's what I love about this, is just topics come up, as we're talking through. So what is the importance of participating in a clinical trial, especially for like the HS community?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is that, I think patients would probably agree that like the current treatments we have right now are not as satisfying as they could be for a lot of people. Like sometimes they're great, and people can be very happy with some of what we have out there. So I'm not saying, and it's much better than what it used to be years ago. But clearly, we need more options. We need things that are better and more consistent, and that people have had trouble tolerating one of the couple things that are approved right now, that we can have an easy next thing to move on to without fighting insurances all the time. And so that's the real goal, is to understand, is to have access to more treatments to show that they actually work, that they're safe and effective. There's all these rigorous processes that go into designing clinical trials, making sure enough people are involved, that it's not just by luck. Like if you see a small study of 15 patients who happen to get a medicine, that can give you like some sense of maybe that drug is somewhat helpful. But if you're not comparing against a placebo, you're not really watching over time, you're not being very objective with how you sort of view things, it's really easy to say, well, I think somebody was getting, this group of patients got better, so maybe it's helpful. So there is this a need for good, high quality, objective evidence where the people's biases aren't there and influencing how we think things are going. And without them, it's just, the way the system we're in right now, at least it's new drugs don't come to market. They're not accessible. Insurance is never going to pay for most of the time unless we've got really good, strong data from clinical trials to back it up. And that's what the FDA requires for drug approval. So it is part of a long and onerous process. But ultimately, it's what puts new drugs in our hands. When I think about like why I like to sort of be part of doing those, like, I could spend all day just, taking care of regular patients in clinic all day with what we have. A lot of what drives things when it comes to like the research that we do, whether it's this kind or otherwise, is, seeing patients, struggle and need more things. I feel like I've got to be part of that solution to get things better, since I'm taking care of so many patients. Or just like when we do, again, research on like HS genetics, is because I know that there is some contribution there that we don't understand. We got to do better. It's same for this. It's kind of going where that need is to make sure that we kind of serve the population the best we can. I think some of that is also, how patients feel about it. And that's how I describe it. Anytime a patient comes in for a clinical trial, is like, I hope, my hope is that, knowing how this medicine works, I think it is likely to be helpful, but I can never guarantee that in a clinical trial. And, especially things like phase 2 and 3 clinical trials are typically have a placebo control for 12 or 16 weeks. And I don't take that lightly, that somebody is going to have to voluntarily potentially not get treatment for 12 to 16 weeks. I think that is the hardest hurdle for, me to feel good about and for patients to feel okay about. So a patient who's really struggling, making them potentially wait 3 months feels, dicey, and they have to, and I want to make sure patients feel very comfortable with that idea and they know that there's potential for that every time. But I think a lot of patients feel that it's an opportunity to contribute. I think that's what motivates a ton of the patients. I tell them, like, the reason I'm doing it is because I feel like it's a way for us to treat everybody else better. And if that syncs with how you feel about it, and you feel like that's a reason to potentially, have some of those risks to go along with the trial, then I'm happy to have you sort of be part of it and contribute. But there should never be pressure to do something like that, to have to, self-sacrifice in a way that is not always certain ahead of time. And, I always tell patients, either, in the discussion we're having now, at any point, you don't have to do this, 4 weeks in, 8 weeks in, 8 months in, if at any point it doesn't feel right, like you are not, stuck in a trial, right? So
Mhm.
it is something where it's very much voluntary. And I think most patients get a sense of fulfillment, especially when we've had trials where it's like, we're in that third or fourth year, they happen to be doing really well. Like we hear, oh, the drug just got approved and it's like everybody else is going to have access to this drug now. I think that is a hugely rewarding experience for patients. I know it is for me, with all the time and effort we spend doing them, is that it pays off in that kind of a way. Sometimes the drugs don't work as well as we want them to, and that's also super helpful because it means we don't go down the wrong path for a lot of patients. That's what I worry about also, is that, kind of people jump on a bandwagon, they think, oh, this thing got approved for psoriasis, it's going to work for HS. And then we start treating people, and it takes a long time to figure out on our individual experiences, is this going to be helpful or not? And we're sort of hoping that it is. But once you have good data, okay, this is maybe not the ideal path to go down. We should be focusing on other things instead. So even when a drug doesn't get to market, it's not successful, it still gives highly valuable information. And of course, like in the back of my mind, I'm also hoping that, again, if the drug works the way that we think it's going to, is that the people participating get better, right? Like that's the biggest win-win situation. Is I see those patients improve over the course of the trial. It's successful on a larger scale. Yet there's no guarantees of those things, but that is always, a huge sort of, reward for me and the patient who's in the trial, that they get maybe access to something they wouldn't have gotten access to otherwise.
Yeah, I think one of the things you said I think was really important was about being upfront with patients about the fact that it may or may not work, and that there is the chance of getting a placebo. And I think those are all really great things to make sure that your patients understand up front. The other thing that I wanted to ask about too was in the past, clinical trials had always been viewed kind of as a last resort for patients. Like if all else has failed, then there may be a clinical trial that you would be eligible for. And I think that kind of is shifting now in the HS space because we have so many opportunities for clinical trials right now. So it's an interesting place for us to be, because one of the things that we know is that there's trouble with recruiting and retention in clinical trials. And what we had talked about in one of our prior episodes was that we can't get drugs to market or help get drugs to market if people aren't participating. And do you think that there's a bit of a sense of like clinical trial naivete amongst the HS community because this is so new for us, that there may be more of a fear, and like this is kind of why we're doing this series, that there may be more of a fear of participating in clinical trials because they haven't been around for us for a really long time?
Yeah, I mean, that may be part of it. I would say like HS or for other diseases, like there's always going to be like a lot of unknowns when it comes to clinical trials. Like the psoriasis patients don't walk in the door and realize that all these clinical trials have gone for the last 20 years. I think everybody, it's new to anybody, I think, who
Okay.
walks in with a condition like this. So I don't think it's, terribly unique to the HS, sort of, HS patients in particular. Um, but that being said, like there is, yeah, this unknown to it. And yeah, sometimes this idea that clinical trials are, the last ditch effort kind of, which has creates some issues sometimes, right? Like, because for a lot of people, because if I can say, look, I've got, am I okay like talking like name brands of medicines or mentioning medicines on something like this, or is that okay?
Yeah.
So if I say, look, there's Humira and Cosentyx that are FDA approved now, like I could probably write this prescription. It's likely going to get covered pretty quickly. We know you're going to be getting something, and you don't have to come every month for a clinical trial as if you were part of a clinical trial. So clinical trials are time intensive. They take, it means that somebody's either got to find time off from work or sort of not be working regular hours every day. Um, they have to travel. They're going to have to travel pretty often. And those early schedules are like 2 weeks, 4 weeks, like, like maybe 2 weeks in, 4 weeks later, and then every sort of month, for 3 months or 6 months or something like that. So it's much simpler for patients to use things that are not go straight to a clinical trial. On the flip side of that, like if all we enroll in clinical trials are patients who've already done Humira, already done Cosentyx, like we are and they haven't worked, like we're automatically enrolling patients who maybe have much more challenging disease to control. And so that might mean that their rates of response are going to tend to be lower. And that we're sort of only including a subset of patients maybe with more advanced and more stubborn disease, as opposed to maybe patients where earlier action, this is the right drug for early action, right? So that's where it's tricky. And yeah, it shouldn't only be offered to patients that have had all these treatment failures in the past. I think really like the goal in long-term studies should not be moderate to severe HS only, right? It should be, as early as we can jump in there and do something. And we have real challenges in measuring early disease and early responses, because it's just harder to measure when there's a lower baseline activity that it's actually shifted in a meaningful way. But we absolutely need some patients who have not been exposed to other medications already to be part of these trials to make sure we're not limiting the types of patients that we treat with the drugs when they come out.
Yeah, yeah, it's such an interesting thing to watch from like start to finish, and like I find myself learning new things every single day about it. And just, this is why I think these things are so important, so that patients really have an understanding of what they're getting into. We realized that a lot of patients thought that even going into a clinical trial, that they're walking into headquarters of, whatever pharma company, and not going to, a dermatology office, and that's even, it's a really overwhelming thought. So to bring it down to like a layman's terms, and let's really understand the ins and outs of it and what's involved, I think is our goal with helping patients want to become involved in clinical trials. And I think, my hope is that retention will increase, and so will recruitment, just with people having a better understanding of what they're getting into, so that, it's not as scary as it once was thought to be.
Definitely. The unknown is always very intimidating.
Yeah.
And one more thing I'll mention about like,
Yeah.
having to be on other medications first is like most clinical trials have washout periods, meaning like you have to be off something like Humira or Cosentyx for 3 months before you can be in the trial. And that can be a big barrier, because like if somebody's on a drug like that and it's kind of helping a little bit, and the idea that they have to do nothing for 3 months and then maybe have 3 months of a placebo period, like that is a big barrier sometimes. So if we only mention it once a patient's already like tried and failed something like that, we're often hitting that sort of long time gap that we have to sort of wait for them to be able to join. So I usually mention, like, if I'm going to mention Cosentyx and Humira as like possibilities, like, by the way, we also have this. If you think you might be interested in the clinical trial, like this is probably the time to do it, because otherwise we're talking about, a few months for the Humira to work, a few months for it to be out of your system if it doesn't work well. And then, it just draws it out to where we might not even be recruiting for it at that point. So I mentioned it earlier as like an opportunity. If you think you might be interested in participating, this would be sort of the right time frame to do it.
Yeah, and I love that approach, because you do need the people who have tried and failed other medications, and then you need the people who this is maybe a good option in lieu of those medications. So yeah, and making sure that the data that we get encompasses all of that is really important. So you're right. We've seen a shift in it moving towards being more, I don't want to call it a treatment option, but more of an earlier potential intervention than just, we've tried everything, now let's try a clinical trial. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind as an HS patient too, the way to look at that and approach that. So
yeah.
Let's talk now about like how trials help the community. I know we kind of talked about we can't get drugs to market without clinical trials, that the FDA has a very, very rigorous protocol that anybody putting a drug through clinical trial has to follow. We talked a little bit in prior episodes about the phases, but I think that we also talked about how long it takes to get a drug to market, and like the cost of getting a drug to market, which is absolutely an astronomical amount, and an astronomical amount of time as well. And you had mentioned here like that the FDA usually requires 2 large-scale randomized trials. So does that include like a phase 2 and 3, or is that 2 phase 3 clinical trials?
That is typically like 2 phase 3 clinical trials.
Okay.
So usually when we see like study results from phase 3 trials come out, what it will describe is 2 trials that are kind of designed identically, that are done side by side. So they recruit like different sites, the like different investigators, like people who are kind of overseeing the trials at all those different sites. And they consider them 2 completely separate trials. They kind of are hoping to recruit both over about the same period of time and have results from both over about the same period of time. But that way, because they've created two separate protocols, they've shown that it's reproducible. It's not just like a fluke having done it one time. Phase 2 trials, it's kind of over here too. It's sort of like a bit of a more proof of concept. Like, phase ones mean all you want to know is like if you give a patient a dose of medication, like how long is it in their system, basic safety. It's going to do a range of doses to try to understand like what are the upper limits of safety and lower limits of sort of it actually having an impact at all. So it's really just understanding like how the different drug doses maybe affect pathways that are important, those kind of things. Phase 2 is where it's sort of like the proof of concept. Let's get 70 patients, 100 patients, 150 patients, depending on what you're trying to really tell at the end and see, like, does there seem like there's a true signal that is likely to be here, that it seems like it's effective and the safety seems good in this early. And they usually will study 2 or 3 doses to figure out, which of these 3 doses might be best. And then the phase 3s are the much larger ones, usually several hundred patients in each one. At least for HS patients, we're usually talking about, between 800 to 1,200 patients across the 2 trials that get done. Some studies of other things, you might have 10,000 patients. They can get insanely large. For other things where it's a rare disease, where you could do it with 30 if it's like a really rare orphan disease might be considered adequate. But you're usually talking about several hundred patients. So that means you need 80 or 100 clinical sites across the country, across the world, typically that are enrolling people. And that often takes a very long period of time, which we'll kind of talk about later. But that's why the cost is so high, is because you are having to involve a lot of people, a lot of locations. They all need training. They all have to be able to bring in their own patients. But that's where the bar is set in terms of like high quality, good evidence that, we have enough patients enrolled that we can actually tell a difference. Like if your response rate is going to be like it is with HS a lot of times, like, 50% for a drug, and it's going to be 30% for placebo on average, like you need a lot of patients to make sure that 20% is real and that it's not by chance. If you only enroll 20 patients, if 3 patients happen to have a good day or 5 patients just happen to have a good day, it means like your results are totally skewed one way or the other. So you need a lot of people to make sure there's not all this variability that confuses everything. And then it also gets you a good idea about safety, right? If you're talking about a serious side effect that happens in 1 out of 100 people, you need several hundred people to even have any sense at all as that thing can actually happen or not. So that's the part of the numbers game is part about looking at safety also. But it means that by the time the drugs get to market, like they actually have really great safety data. If you think about how many patients with HS get put on like clindamycin or doxycycline, like guess how many studies for HS have been done for clindamycin and doxycycline in a randomized way where you're really looking at side effects objectively, like nothing, right? Like, there's some looking back at how patients kind of did, but like we have much worse evidence for these things we do all the time. And, bad things can happen with antibiotics. People get rashes, things can happen. We're less scared of those medicines, I think, because they've been so normalized and because we haven't tracked those side effects maybe to the same extent. But like, when you're looking at a medication like, Humira or Cosentyx, where it's like thousands of patients, tens of thousands of patients being studied super intensely, like rare side effects get pointed out because if you have 10,000 people, rare things happen sometimes. And so it can also create, I think, like extra fear, like more labeling because they have been so highly scrutinized. But it means, you can be pretty reassured that like the FDA is very skittish. Like if they think there is a strong signal for danger, like they're not going to let it come out typically, or if they find it after the fact, they're not going to let it. So, that extra scrutiny can lead to more worry, I think, because it just means there's more details out there about it. Just listed, it goes on and on, but it also is like reassuring that like if bad things are going to happen, they typically are going to get picked up on.
One of the things that we often find is that, typically some of these drugs are used in other indications and have found a home with HS. And especially in drugs like Humira, for instance, where there is a lot of it's used for rheumatoid arthritis or in a different age group population. Then HS is typically a little bit on the younger side of the population. So we found it hard, I think, sometimes to understand what the actual like safety data is for like HS specifically, because nothing is necessarily broken down into what the safety data is per like, per indication or per disease state. And so like, do you have any feedback on that? I mean, because we're kind of like lumping everybody into one huge category, which makes it harder to determine the safety data for us in particular.
Yeah, no, it's a good point because different conditions can have different, comorbidities or other things that might change the risk profile a bit between different conditions. Or, things like Crohn's disease, for instance, like Cosentyx, people thought it would work for Crohn's disease, but it actually like by chance, like led to increased risk of like flares of Crohn's disease in that population. So you wouldn't be able to extrapolate that safety data from something else. Um, there's individual trials done for each indication, right? So there were like the HS trials for Humira, there's HS trials for Cosentyx, same for newer drugs that are coming down the pike. Like, so you can look at that data and get a sense of, yeah, how often did things happen? And generally, like it tends to be relatively even across most of the studies when for medications like this. Like, so you could pull up those phase 3 studies and see, okay, what percent of patients got infections or had other kind of other kind of side effects on average, and how did it compare to placebo? Um, and so you could look at it, but that is, looking at several hundred patients. And if you look at combined data across all the trials, you're looking at, many thousands of patients. So again, like rare events are going to become more obvious in those cases. So there's benefit both ways. Like, there's a limit to being able to recruit 10,000 HS patients, for sort of a safety only study. It'd be nice, but it's just, yeah, there's just real, limitations in terms of like how many trials can actually be done and how many patients can be recruited. Um, yeah, you get a general sense of like, does that overall safety look very similar to the other trials? And when you combine the trials, the rates are kind of similar. There's no outlier effect that seems to be happening. So yeah, you can get some of it individually. Some of it is having to rely on sort of mixing it with the safety from other conditions too.
Yeah, yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that becomes something in the future that we get kind of more
Mhm.
personalized information on, so to speak. Just something that you find in looking at the information that's harder, like to extrapolate as a patient or a patient advocate to give that information. And then we also feel nervous about that too, obviously, because
Yeah,
I don't want to lead people astray. So it's definitely
yeah.
something to keep an eye on.
The other part of I don't want to like increase fear, like, beyond what it should be. But the other real caveat is that, like, when clinical trials are recruited, there's a lot of inclusion and exclusion criteria. Who's allowed to be part of that study, right? Like, if somebody's had a history of cancer, they're considering pregnancy. There's like lots of populations that end up, being excluded on purpose because if you don't know the risks yet, you don't want to take a population that might be higher risk. And so for real world use, maybe it could be the risk is slightly different because there are all those real world implications that happen. And a lot of the safety data for those things come from like after the fact studies, right? Like looking at, once a drug like, Humira that's been around 20 years, you can go back and look at, all the patients in the health system that have been prescribed Humira, see do their rates of something like cancer differ than people who never got exposed to Humira who have the same condition, right? And so that's where, once a drug is out there, especially that long, like you have a pretty good sense that like if there were those higher risks that were out there, even for rare things, we would pick up on them. Like, you can look at, hundreds of thousands of patients who've been exposed to like TNF inhibitors like Humira and know that from a cancer standpoint, like this has been done like over and over again in studies after the fact, like there do not seem to be increased rates of cancers other than a very slightly increased risk of non-melanoma skin cancers, which are super common anyway, and that are usually like not life-threatening types of skin cancers. But that's a small change. And if that small change got picked up on, those same studies should have picked up on a change in like pancreatic cancer if there was like a true risk associated with those things. So yeah, the longer it goes, the more patients get exposed in the real world, and the more we can look back at those real life exposures, it also becomes much more reassuring. Like,
Yeah.
I could go on a long tangent about like a side effect, after the fact, like true risk of side effects and benefits of medication too, because the benefits often get much more apparent too as time goes on in those studies in terms of like, we know that medicines like these maybe reduce rates of heart attacks and strokes because they reduce the inflammation for patients who have rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis and probably HS to some extent. So there are protective effects that we learn about that can also help balance out all the scary things.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's and like with anything in life, right? There's benefits and drawbacks. It doesn't
Mhm.
matter what
Exactly.
we're putting up for discussion.
Yeah.
Um, so when it comes to making trials successful, or what dictates if a trial is successful or not, and I always say I pity because HS is such a moving target, it feels like, and it's so hard to define. Like when you're looking at a clinical trial for a cancer per se, it's like, did the tumor grow? Did the tumor not grow? And like that is, your answer basically. And for HS, it is constantly a moving target. So can you talk to us a little bit about that? Like what dictates successful trials and how are those determined?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Like the bar, now you have to pick some what's called like a primary endpoint, and that is like the bar, like the main measure that you're going to check on to see if the patient is like responding to treatment or has had a positive sort of outcome of some kind. So usually for HS trials, it's what's called this high score response, so hidradenitis suppurativa clinical response. And I've got it written out here. It's a little bit complicated. It's a 50% reduction in nodules and abscesses if you combine those two things together. And at the same time, you can't have more of the tunnels that are draining or abscesses increasing separately from that. And um, there are some faults to this. It seems to overall like relatively reflect, how a patient is really doing or how much they're responding. But the trouble is, like you said, HS is such a moving target that some patients by chance end up having 50% less activity on one day versus another. And so that's why we see placebo response rates, like a patient who's not actually getting any treatment at all for the first 12 weeks. Those placebo response rates have been, as low as around 20% in some studies, but as high as almost 50% in others, which is extremely confusing, especially when you have smaller studies. And so, yeah, that chance alone variation is a real challenge for hidradenitis studies in particular. I think I've got like a couple graphs up on the right side that I can kind of use to illustrate that point a little bit. If you don't mind clicking forward, and actually one more
Oh,
time.
yeah,
So like
perfect.
these are a couple like outcome sort of graphs from clinical trials. And so if you look at the one on the top there, it kind of shows you that if you look at, week 0, the very beginning, all the way on the left of it, and as you get out to the right side, you see that patients are improving. And the lower down bar is the placebo. That means patients weren't getting any medicine. And the higher up one, patients were getting medicine. So you see a difference of about 30% here, right? About 58, 59% of patients responding on the top one versus about 27% on the lower one. And so that's a clear separation that's there. You have enough patients to know that that's real on a study like this. But you have other cases where it's maybe a 10% difference, right? Or you have like, just by chance, the placebo is a bit higher and the treatment's a bit lower. And that's where it's like, is it really meaningful? If the change is only 10% of patients maybe are truly responding to the medicine and it's not just by chance alone. And what I would also point out is that a high score, is a 50% reduction, right? So I would argue that if somebody goes from having 10 abscesses and nodules down to 5, like they're better, but should they like really be satisfied? Like, is that really a happy person that still has like that much disease activity? It's improvement, but it is a relatively low bar in my mind. But I think as we were sort of getting these first drugs out, it was a matter of saying, okay, like we want to make sure there's some signal there. Like some of these patients here are responding much better than 50%. And if you look at the two lower down ones, what people call like a high score 75 and a high score 90, that means 75% reduction in abscess and nodules or 90%. And then you also see these like the bars on the left are a bit the sort of scale's a bit deceptive here. You can see on a different medication here, like the placebo response bar, which is the light gray bar towards the right, for the high score 75 is 16% versus 26% and 22% for the active drugs, right? So there's a separation there. And these patients who have high score 75s are feeling much, much better probably than what they were when they began. And same for the high score 90s. Again, you see a difference of only about 10% between placebo and the active drug. So this is like where it gets tough sometimes to interpret like how meaningful is it when there's only a 10% difference. I mean, I think it can be hugely meaningful, like because again, you have some patients who are partially there, their conditions at least stable, which means it's not getting worse. And that's something that we don't really consider in the outcome is like a lack of worsening is actually very important if somebody's progressively, seeing things go the wrong way. But my point would be that the deep responses like are not as good, not as high as I would like to see them, right? I would like to see 60% of patients getting a high score 90 response rather than a high score 50 response when it comes down to it. And the bar we're setting right now is a bit lower, and just hopefully if new drugs come along, we see it is better than this. So a successful study, again, like the primary outcome, whatever people say ahead of time they want to measure, whether it's high score 50, high score 75, you've got to beat placebo or whatever comparator you're using. Like the real ideal situation is that 10 years from now, our drugs get better and we're not willing to settle for a bare minimum against placebo, right? We would say, okay, like if Humira was the initial baseline, then we're going to compare our new drug against Humira to show that we're actually better than the status quo. But when it's a very new sort of, disease being treated with drugs like this, it's like you don't know where to set that bar. You have to compare against inactive treatment first to make sure you can beat sort of nothing if nothing was the status quo. And then the other part is over time, like, and people always measure these things. They also measure lots of other stuff. Like my first thing I'm usually looking at are things like these high score 75s and 90s, because I think that's what represents, real improvement over just a high score 50. Also looking at things like quality of life measures, right? Like those are secondary endpoints. Like they're things that aren't always the first headline, but they're getting measured to see, how much is it affecting, things like, pain on an everyday basis, like what your average pain is over the course of days, how much drainage there is, how much is it, itching, disturbing sleep, all these other measures get taken at the same time typically. And so that also gives you a sense of, okay, like hopefully you're having a positive impact on how people live their life too. Ideally, your primary outcome measure, that if that gets better, the quality of life should almost always improve too. If those are mismatched, where like if a high score 75 didn't correlate at all to quality of life improvement, we're not measuring the right thing. But typically there's a pretty good correlation there.
And those quality of life measures are why you're filling out the same forms all the time too. And that's,
Yes.
we talked about that in another episode about like, why am I filling out the same forms over and over? It feels like the definition of insanity. And that is
Yeah.
exactly why. So that those secondary outcome measures and those quality of life improvements or not lack of improvement can be tracked, and that you should see, the same kind of trend as people tend to get better on the medication, that their quality of life improves. And like you said, if it's not, then something is amiss.
Right.
So there is a direct correlation to why they're being asked to complete, those daily diaries or all of that paperwork and information over and over. Because I think that was one of the things we talked about, is how off-putting that can be. Like, does somebody realize I'm filling out this same thing every day? It's like, yes, it's designed for a purpose. So
Yeah.
this is exactly why, so that you can see all of this layout exactly like
Right.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I can't go back to the study monitors and say, yep, this patient looks good. This one doesn't look so good. They're a lot better. This one's not. Like unless you have that objective measure you're doing over and over again, it's tedious, but it's the only way to kind of make sure things are changing the right way.
Yeah, definitely. Um, and then finally, like we kind of talked about this before and in another episode, but why does it take so long? It feels like, especially for patients who have gone through clinical trials and who have had success, are like twiddling their thumbs, like just waiting for approval to come through. And we did talk about like open extensions and things like
Mhm.
that in a prior episode too, so that if the drug does work for you, you're not in most cases just like, okay, well, thanks for participating, glad it worked, have a good day.
Right.
To make sure that patients are taken care of through that process, and that if they did have success, that they can continue with that success. So do you want to talk a little bit about that too? Because I think it can't be mentioned enough that a lot of times
Yeah.
there is an extension and availability to continue on that med.
Yeah, no, that absolutely like varies over time. I mean, there are, multiple phases to studies, and each of those studies requires like a very detailed and long protocol of like how it's going to be designed. The FDA has to review that and give feedback for each step. And so like a phase one is small, like, if you sort of doing that proof of concept, you're going to recruit 15 or 20 patients, doesn't always take a huge amount of time. Then you got to assure that the safety is good, and then write your second protocol for your phase two study, and then sort of figure out from your phase one study, if you know how the drug is, interacting in the system, what's the right dose, what's the half-life, how often should you give it, all those kind of things. So, then the phase two happens, and a phase two again might be like 100 or 150 patients. There might be, 15 sites or something like that that have to get put together. And then usually those studies are going to last, the most important data is going to be around 12 or 16 weeks in. But it might take, 6 months for all the patients to be recruited across all the sites, or 9 months. And then you've got to watch them for 3 or 4 months to see, are they actually responding or not. And then the FDA might want 6 months of safety data at least, and want you to continue to watch over time. And then you can develop your phase three. And your phase three with several hundred patients and many, many sites, like that usually takes, 6 to 12 months minimum to get sites onboarded. And then once it starts recruiting, you've got to recruit, for 18 months to get several hundred patients even started. And you got to wait 16 more weeks, for them to hit the primary endpoint, to know if it's working, you'd like to know that it's worked. And then usually the FDA wants at least a year of safety data after that from your phase three trial. So like, even if you start your clock at the sort of, the phase three trial just started enrolling, I just joined the study, when is the drug going to be approved? Like, 18 months of time recruiting for a study, another 4 months just for the outcome measures of like, did it work or not? And then sort of a year for whether or not it's going to be safe or not. And then you got to put in your FDA application. And that usually takes, minimum 6 months to review if it's a drug that's already on the market, that's approved for other things, and you're just going for a new indication. But it could be a year for a new drug that's not been on the market before. And so that tacks on even more time. So, when I see a phase three drug just started recruiting, I tell patients it is, very best case scenario, like 3 years, probably more like 4 is even optimistic, and 5 is like likely where it's going to end up. So we have, at least a few things in sort of phase 3 trials now. Some of them are winding down. And so we are at a point where, we're maybe 2.5 years out for a couple things. Most of the ones that are just building now are more like 4 years out, probably, or 5 years out. So right now it's been, again, there was Humira in 2015. It took 8 years to get, the next drug, Cosentyx, after that. We're going to have probably another one by the end of the year. And then we'll have 2 or 3 years where not much happens. And I think we'll have over a 5-year period, maybe 5 or 6 drugs that come out altogether. So it's just waiting for those timelines to play out.
Yeah, I think in a lot of our minds, it seems more like the beginning of a race where everybody starts together. And I think that's what we believe is happening, but really, like you mentioned, it takes 18 months to recruit for a full trial. So, you may start with one or two other people at the same time, but there's a bunch of people at multiple stages of recruitment.
Yeah.
So I think that's important to keep in mind that, yeah, it is a really long process even to fill the recruitment need.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, as an HS community, we can really step up and help make sure that we're meeting those needs. Because the other thing we had talked about too is that if we don't show up and they don't get enough people to participate, then they can't move forward, which means we're potentially keeping further treatment options from being available for our entire community because of a
Right.
lack of participation. And, there's a lot of interest in HS right now. And if we miss out on this wave of interest and that these pharmaceutical companies can't fill their trial recruitment, then we miss out on this wave and it won't come back again. So it's really important for us to, if you are in a position that you can participate in a trial and something seems right for you, to really investigate that further, to ask your physician, to go to hsconnect.org, we typically tell people not to go to clinicaltrials.gov because it's such an overwhelming site with their information.
Yeah.
But to take a look at what's available and always ask your physician, reach out and ask what clinical trials are available, so that we don't miss this wave and that we can have, a plethora of treatment options that will work for different people. So, you had mentioned writing up the report to then submit to the FDA. What does that timeline usually look like? Is that a couple? You said 1 to 2 years on here. Okay.
Well, so yeah, so it's a lot of times for stuff like this, it's like, the data stops coming in at a certain point, but a lot of it's already there, right? So the companies are usually like doing interim analyses when it's halfway enrolled, kind of they're checking all along the way and building all this information up so they can kind of just update as they go along to some extent. And so usually those reports are in the process of being built, as the trial is actually kind of going and as it gets closer to finish, they're kind of compiling more, they're getting all the safety like all the safety data together and kind of bundled, and they just kind of update at the end again. So they're working on those things, but then there's a lot of final analyses that have to be done from like a statistical standpoint. So probably it takes, say they hit the 1 year mark, they lock all the data. They got to make sure everything's like clean and looks right from all the sites. Then they'll probably take 3 to 6 months to sort of finalize that report. And then that report would get submitted, hopefully by that time frame, and that starts the clock with the FDA kind of looking at it.
Yeah, it's such a labor intensive process.
Yeah.
From start to finish. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. And one thing I'll mention, like, we talked briefly about like, phase 1, 2, and 3, and there's often open label extensions, that kind of thing. So, like, I think there's also like fear that this is like a new drug. It's never been tested on anybody before too, those kind of things. Like phase 1 is sort of like, that's the phase where there is sort of like least certainty or sort of most difficult to predict like how much true benefit there is to the trial participant, right? Like you are figuring out that it's safe, maybe what the right dose is. Those things also only last like a month typically, or a couple of months, because it's really you're just getting 1 or 2 doses and then watching for a brief period of time afterwards. There's typically not an open label extension. Those drugs are often like, on a very small scale being made even at that point. And so those are short-term little bursts of participation where, again, like everybody's going to be getting the active thing. There's no placebo. There's nothing to compare against at all. So yeah, if it works well, like some people might get that temporary benefit from it, but it's probably not going to be like the long-term plan. And there probably won't be an open label extension. Again, these are super small. Many more people will be in phase 2 and 3 trials than in phase 1 trials. phase 2 trials, that's hundreds of patients. A lot of times they will have an open label extension going out at least a year. And if the drug is successful, they will sometimes tack on, 2, 3, 4 years of open label extension as sort of like an extra study at the end, but they don't always guarantee it for a phase 2, especially if it's not helpful. They don't want to have it in place there and have designed it and then like not have a reason to really need it there at all. But ideally, there's an opportunity for that where patients just aren't left hanging after 6 months. And then phase threes is where there's almost always a long-term open label extension where if you join that study, you are very likely to be able to continue on the drug until it hits the market. You can get it that way instead. So phase threes can be very, more attractive for that purpose sometimes, is the fact that like you do get this option for long-term almost always with it. It also means there's more safety data that's already been generated before. But for a lot of these, even the phase 1s and 2 studies, like from a safety standpoint or how scary they are, like Cosentyx, for instance, that was approved on the market for years, like not a new drug, like at all, like great safety data already out there. And that's the case for a lot of HS drugs. They're drugs that are approved for other things, or they're super similar to drugs that are approved for other things. So even though it's maybe new to HS, like these are drugs with a long history out there. Like that's a question you can always ask about is like, is this a drug that's already out there or like it's similar? Like, if it's, like we're doing one called povorcitinib for a company right now. It's a JAK inhibitor. There's lots of JAK inhibitors on the market for other things. This is a new one, so it's slightly different than the others, but it's very closely related. So we can kind of infer what the likely safety data is going to look like. So if you're kind of wondering, am I the guinea pig? Is this like, has anybody else ever gotten this medicine before? Like usually the answer is yeah, like probably thousands of people have gotten this medicine before, tens of thousands even. It's just for HS, it's something where we need to make sure it actually works in the right way.
Yeah, and I think that's really a good question to ask your provider as well, or when if you're going in and talking to a clinical trial site, is to ask that question. I think it's a great thing to ask because I think most people instantly think mouse to me basically when they're entering a clinical trial, and that was the other purpose of trying to do this, is to really help understand that some of these things have been used for a really long time and there is great safety data, and it's just looking at the effectiveness for HS now and does this
Right.
work. And based on the amount of money that pharmaceutical companies have to put in to even check this, they're betting the farm on these drugs working. And like you had mentioned before, and we had talked about previously, that there's something to be learned and gleaned even from medications that don't end up making it.
Yep.
And I think that, that it's a hard lesson for companies because, they've put a lot of money into those medications. But they're really betting the farm that this was going to work when they get to this point. So everyone is cheering it on and hoping that it has good results. The one thing I wanted to ask you about, and I'm going to stop sharing so we can chat here. The one thing I wanted to ask about, and we haven't really talked about before, is trials for juveniles. How does that work? And like, do you have to have a certain amount of time? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, there's often like more scrutiny around those trials in terms of like looking at safety. The trouble is, and it kind of depends on what you're treating exactly. Like almost always adult studies get done first because a lot of times there's just more adults that are affected in general and more adults willing to participate. And that's, what somebody's gonna like, often there's like sort of proof of concept that's safe in adults, then we're going to move on to like adolescents, people who are in that 12 to 18 time frame. And if that seems pretty good, then we're going to look even younger than that. I mean, the caveat is if you're talking about something that only affects little kids, like you've got to study in little kids to start with. But almost always it goes the other way. Starts with older folks, like if they're adults, and then kind of goes down sort of in age ranges. Like Humira, for instance, like never had a study in adolescents, right? There are no patients that were in clinical trials age 12 to 18 with hidradenitis for Humira, but they had a lot of approvals for other indications for adolescents. So people who have Crohn's disease, psoriasis in that 12 to 18 range. And they said, look, we have all the safety data that shows that it seems to be safe in adolescents. And most people with HS didn't just get it when they turned 18. Like they had this before. It is the same condition. It is just on a continuum. And so they did what's called like a label extension, where basically they said, we got all the safety data. They did a very limited studying where they looked at just if you give patients doses, is it metabolized in the same way for adolescents with HS? And that was enough to get the label extension board approved. And that's just more likely to happen when there are few treatment options out there or no treatment options like there were at that time. So there's going to be more flexibility for that kind of thing. there's a bigger push now for the medications coming along to do adolescent studies to show that yes, that is safe and effective. We have this safety data. It's not going to, the trials aren't going to be as big typically. It's often like I said, they've done their adult trials. They're going to do a smaller trial in adolescents to show that there seems to be some positive signal. There's decent safety. So these are going to be trials with like 20 people as opposed to like several hundred people. Um, because it's also just harder to recruit. Like if I look at our clinic, only about 10% of patients with HS that I see are adolescents. We have some pediatric dermatologists that see them also. So that's, for the under 18 crowd, it's just a smaller slice overall. And then for those that are under 18, like this isn't saying that like patients that are under 18 like don't get bad disease. Some of them have very severe disease, but on average, probably because it just hasn't been around as long, like on average, they're not quite as severe. So recruiting into population into a study like that is more difficult when you're talking about 10% of the overall population, maybe only, a quarter of those would actually qualify for the study criteria. And then on top of that, it's like a kid who's in school who's going to have trouble coming in every 4 weeks for a study visit. So like, there's realities that kind of creep in here where it's like you get some leeway, but having some proof of concept is helpful. The other alternative is when you design your initial studies, if you're pretty sure you want it to be done in adolescents also, is that you include a sub-study of adolescent patients where they recruited alongside, that you're aiming to get at least however many for each of the, like, kind of overall for all the sites, and you can do it at the same time, but it is more complicated to do that up front and more costly to do that up front. So a lot of companies are just trying to get things moving and won't necessarily plan all of that at the same time. But there will be
Yeah.
two, probably, I don't think I'm saying anything that's, there are highly likely to be at least a couple of adolescent studies recruiting over the next year.
And then as far as, we had talked earlier about mild to moderate disease as opposed to everything right now seems to be recruiting for moderate to severe. Do you think we're going to see a lot, like an uptick in the number of clinical trials that are going on for mild to moderate in the coming years?
I think there will be some. I think the majority in the short term, at least, will still be looking at moderate to severe just because we know how to measure it and we know how to
Yeah.
like get outcomes for it. And like there are all kinds of challenges around studying early disease, like I mentioned, like a low baseline, like, the way it gets measured now is like a patient comes in, I count up how many, and it's always subjective. Like you have probably, seen enough, pictures of HS or talk, it looks very different person to person and like how you can, and if you bring in 3 expert people who see a ton of HS, they might count completely differently for each area. So you try to be consistent in how you measure things, but you can imagine it if you're talking about early disease, that might mean somebody who gets, two nodules a month, right, would be considered early or not as bad as what we see in trials. Right now, the minimum is typically 5 at any given time. Um, and ideally, I could give something, we give people stuff all the time who just get 2 nodules every month. But like, how do I measure that in a clinical trial? Like they show up and they might say, I've got nothing today, right? Or they might show up and they've got 2 or 3 things on that day, but maybe on the average day, they actually don't have anything. So they're much more likely to, by chance, look better when they come in one other day if they're at their peak worst ever when they come in with 2 or 3 nodules. So there's a lot of pitfalls to missing, a positive outcome or again, high placebo rates because you recruit people only at their peak level of activity when they have, generally like lower activity at baseline. So then the question is, do you have to measure over time, which I think is like maybe going to be what it has to be is I can't just look once. Like I've got to look, every 2 weeks for 2 or 3 months, prior to them actually starting the medication. And then after that, we're going to kind of measure it like, week, it's sort of week 12, like, we get to week 12, but then we have to measure the next 2 months every 2 weeks again to see like, what is the overall number that, or you'd have to trust, a lesion diary or patients submitting photographs every 2 weeks of all the affected areas that were being treated to say, okay, we can track out and see that there is this over time, less activity happening. To really know that you have sort of slowed things down and kind of stopped it. So right now, to like prove that those are actually like good ways to measure anything at all, like you'd have to study, how meaningful is that to patients. There's a lot that has to be done to create scales that are meaningful to even set up trials like that. You have to validate them, or there may be other ways to do it too. Again, I think people are thinking through this problem right now, like how do we intervene earlier? How do we measure it earlier? And also, again, like not have to make patients wait for 6 months to like start a trial, right? Because like that's the other big thing. Is like, what about progression, right? Like somebody who goes from an occasional nodule to getting, tunnels and scarring, that might take a year to happen. And there's no way anybody feels comfortable putting patients on a placebo for a year just to see what happens, right?
Right.
Um, There might be ways to do like rescue type studies where it's like, the moment a patient hits a certain threshold of activity, they get to switch over to the treatment, like half get placebo, and then you sort of do these rescue protocols to see how many, kind of got to that point, but don't let it go past a certain level. So these are, again, yeah, these are like the challenging questions of like what is ethical, like what is fair to patients, and how do we, and sort of what kind of what can we allow, knowing that there's maybe long-term potential benefit again if drugs get to market and we can intervene earlier. So I think that will happen some. I think because people want to develop topical medicines also, which are a huge need. Like what could you put on just every day if maybe it's not so bad you want to be on a biologic. Um, I think it's going to require coming up with some novel scales like that. And I think people outside of companies are all interested in this and trying to figure out a way to do it better.
Yeah, I literally am constantly in awe of you guys that deal with this on your end of it, because it truly, you have to really put thought behind how you're going to measure things and have meaningful outcomes and I mean, it's really it's a job in and of itself to figure all of this out, and keeping, patients at the forefront of that, of like, we don't want to cause harm, we want to do good, but then how do we measure this and what does this look like and to what point? So I'm truly in awe of you guys, seriously, because I think it is such an undertaking, and to the people who participate in clinical trials, it's so meaningful. But I can't thank you enough for your time today. I mean, like I said, I learn new stuff every single day and I've learned a ton. It's fascinating. And I really appreciate your time. I appreciate all of the information that you gave us, and it just gives me more to think about, because I think that I'm loving the uptick of patient engagement in the design and study protocol design for HS, because I think that's also going to help patients be able to stay in trials longer, and help the recruitment piece of it when you're getting that input from
Mm.
patients along the way, and that when patients or patient advocates are working in tandem with you guys on figuring out what those primary endpoints are, and coming up with that, and the quality of life, I think that's really meaningful and helps patients and other patients want to be more involved in clinical trials too, knowing that that was all taken into account and taken into consideration. So it's just
Yeah,
fascinating. So
yeah. No, it's a challenging area where it's again like I have to like I need better things. I got to do better for patients because yeah, to not have the tools that I need is not fun for me and it's not fun for the patients. Like I want it to be better than what it is, and so this is like the way to do it. It's slow, like with anything like where you have to sort of study and watch. Whether it's like on the lab side with basic science or with things like this, it just takes a lot of time and effort, but it can pay off big. I mean, people never start these like huge journeys, it never gets better. I'm always like, in awe of the patients who are like willing to go through all this, that like can come every 4 weeks, and some of them are driving an hour and a half or 2 hours, but it's like, they are invested, and knowing that maybe this isn't going to help me, but like I got to help other people like me. Like they've sort of been through it enough. They never want anybody to suffer like they have. And yeah, it's a huge motivator too.
yes, yeah. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks at SHSA. So,
Yeah,
but
absolutely. Sounds
yes,
great.
absolutely. And thank you to Acelerin for sponsoring this webinar series, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.